Hi, everyone. We're ready to get started if we can. My name is Dan McLeod. I'm the director of the Jesuit Center here at St. Paul's. Thanks you all for being here. A nice crowd of students and community members and our faculty from St. Paul's. Thank you to everyone who makes this possible. Crystal from our office, Peter Janakis, of course, the St. Paul's College Foundation, and everyone who does all the good work here at St. Paul's. I'm very excited today to welcome Dr. Peter Ludlow, who's coming to us today from Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. Peter has a PhD from Queen's University, Belfast. He's the past president of the Canadian Catholic Historical Association and is the current editor of the CCHA's journal, Historical Studies, the only Canadian journal dedicated to Catholic history. Dr. Ludlow has written widely on ethnicity and religion, especially the Irish and Scottish religion in Nova Scotia and Eastern Canada. His work is, I think, characterized by a great breadth in its examination of both kind of social movements within the Catholic Church and the people, the priests, the bishops, and their lay collaborators who bring a lot of these social movements about. His 2022 book, Disciples of Antigonish, addresses these movements, the most famous of which is the Antigonish Movement, which he's going to talk about today in great detail. It was my favorite book that I read last year while I was on sabbatical, living in the Diocese of Antigonish. And he would, when you're reading a book and sometimes you read about these places and some of them, it would seem like they were New York City, but I was like right next door to them and there would be like 4 people live in this community. And then everyone settled in Margaree Harbor, which is, about 9 houses. So I'm very excited to hear Peter's talk today and to welcome him, his first ever trip to Manitoba and to Winnipeg. Dr. Ludlow.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. Appreciate you coming out. It is wonderful to be here at St. Paul's College. Like Dan said, it is my first time to Manitoba. But before you think I'm an untraveled blue noser, I will tell you I spent my undergraduate years building twister grain bins in Saskatchewan. So if you put the stuff outside and gave me a crane, by 10 o'clock tonight, we'd have a grain bin outside the college. So I haven't been to Manitoba, but I've been to 75% of the farms in Saskatchewan, so it's really nice to be back west. This afternoon, I want to talk to you about the Antigonish Movement, which was the formal program of the St. Francis Xavier University Extension Department. Beginning formally in 1928-1929, the Diocese of Antigonish, Nova Scotia, through its diocesan college, founds a program of study clubs, consumer cooperatives, and credit unions, which were a manifestation, of a local belief in the value of Catholic social teaching. The events of that era and its personalities, such as Monsignor Moses Michael Cody, still loom large within the historical memory of Atlantic Canada. The belief that under the right circumstances, people can become masters of their own destiny, as Cody titled his famous 1939 book, is still felt, however subtly, in a region that still remains economically challenged and mostly politically marginalized. So today, I want to take you through the anatomy of the movement a little bit, highlight some of the components that were critical in building one of Canada's most famous social and economic endeavors. We'll trace its beginnings, we'll speak to some successes, and focus on some reasons why it ultimately waned. Very briefly, just to get started, I just want to give you a little context to the diocese, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Antigonish, Nova Scotia. So it's situated in the northeast. It's comprised of the mainland counties of Pictou, Antigonish, and Guysborough, as well as the entire island of Cape Breton. So the top part, the northeast part, and the top right is comprises the diocese. So the presence in the region goes back to the late 17th century when Jesuit missionaries were welcomed into Mi'kma'ki by the indigenous Mi'kmaq, further bolstered by French-speaking Acadians in the 18th century, strengthened by Gaelic-speaking migrants from Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland in the 19th century, and then topped up by Newfoundlanders, Italians, and Eastern Europeans in the early 20th century. Now, there are various factors we could talk, I think, all day, or it's in the book, that made Antigonish important. But the diocese is one of the older English-speaking Catholic centers in Canada, so it continually supplies the rest of the country with bishops and priests and women religious. As the eminent historian of the country's Catholic history, Mark McGowan, has noted, Eastern Nova Scotia was instrumental in constructing a great pan-Canadian Catholic network. Faithful to the teachings of the Church, dedicated to building schools and hospitals, and willing to be guided by their clergy even against their own partisan instincts, Roman Catholics in the region make great gains throughout the 19th century. And it's no coincidence that the first Roman Catholic Prime Minister of Canada, Sir John Thompson, is the representative of Antigonish County. Okay. So any social movement inspired by faith, either in the 1920s or today, must begin by identifying a need, something I think sometimes in our modern church we struggle to do. By 1900, Nova Scotia is facing some tremendous challenges. In the rural and coastal areas, poverty has taken hold of the mostly subsistence farmers and the fishermen, and the young people are out migrating en masse. By 1890, some 100,000 young people had left the Maritimes. Most of you in the back of the room, that means if you're in Nova Scotia then, you're getting out of there. Where are you going? You're going to Ontario. Some are coming here to Western Canada, but most of you are going to the New England states, to what they would have called the Boston states. So you're all going to mostly to Boston and the towns like Newton, just outside of Boston. At one point, the outmigration from the countryside of rural Cape Breton is so intense, newspapers mused that the young people were as scarce as hen's teeth, which is pretty scarce. Now, I want to personalize the situation a little bit, if you'll indulge me. The older woman sitting on the left is Margaret MacDonald Campbell. She's my third great-grandmother. Now, Margaret's grandfather came out to Eastern Nova Scotia from Keppoch in Inverness, Scotland in 1804. He settles on some 200 acres of farmland in the rural parish of St. Andrews in Antigonish County, and despite the challenges, and there are many challenges, the family does pretty well. Margaret married Angus Campbell, the descendant of Catholic Campbells from Glengarry, Scotland, and they were much more than subsistence farmers. They developed their own local industries, and they even shipped produce to Newfoundland. So they're doing pretty well. Yet for various reasons, demographics, market changes, inequities within the Canadian Confederation, agriculture in the Maritime provinces begins to lag by about 1900. More and more of these farms are being mortgaged, and families are struggling. Now, Margaret MacDonald Campbell is one of those older mothers who watches her children leave home for Boston. All five, 3 girls and 2 boys, go to the United States, never to return. 2 of her sons are electrocuted while working as linemen. It's a very dangerous job that a lot of maritime men took up when they went to the States. And 3 of her daughters spent their lives in domestic service, so as maids or cooks, mostly for private families, which is a lot of maritime girls would do. If not for the fact that one of those daughters got pregnant out of wedlock and sent her infant daughter home to be raised by her parents, that part of my own maternal history, my own maternal family, like so many others in Eastern Nova Scotia, would have disappeared completely. And so the wee girl sitting next to Margaret is my great-grandmother. Now, in the strict ultramontane setting of the late 19th century, believers like Margaret MacDonald Campbell are fiercely loyal to the church, and they're the backbone of the Antigonish Diocese. It's the rural and coastal families like the Campbells who attend Mass. They give monies for infrastructure. They steer their children into religious life, and they offer their resources for the priest's upkeep. And I have a picture of Margaret's niece, Christy MacDonald, who joined the Halifax-based Sisters of Charity, just to show how intertwined these families were with the church on all levels. These families also poured their monies that they accumulated back into the church. So let me just give you a really quick example. When Margaret's brother-in-law dies in 1930, in his will, just going to list it for you, he left $25 to the St. Francis Xavier Mission College of Scarborough for their work in China, which we know is a Scarborough Foreign Mission. He leaves $30 to St. Vincent de Paul Society, $500 to Father Alexander MacDonald, the parish priest at St. Andrews, for masses for the repose of his soul. A further $400 to Father MacDonald, who incidentally would later become Bishop of Victoria, British Columbia, for the good of the parish. $25 to Patrick Bray, a former neighbor who later became Bishop of St. John, New Brunswick. And incredibly, this old man also left $2,000 for the education of diocesan seminarians. That from one old man who spent a lifetime working 100 acres of property. This is the kind of commitment we see from average Catholics across the agricultural and coastal districts. But in the early 1920s, these people are quickly disappearing. Margaret dies in 1927. Their children are building their lives in Boston, and the local culture and the faith are under threat. Now, at the same time that the agricultural and coastal districts are in trouble in Nova Scotia, the burgeoning coal mines and steel mills of Cape Breton Island are attracting labor from across the globe. I can't stress enough that after the establishment of the Dominion Coal Company in 1893, the greater Sydney Cape Breton area becomes one of the most important manufacturing centers in Canada. I think sometimes people forget that today. Not only does industry pull in thousands of Catholic migrants into the region, but it also creates a Catholic renaissance within the diocese as new parishes, schools, and hospitals are constructed throughout the colliery towns. The problem, however, is that industrialization brings social and economic problems to a diocese, that's always had a rural mentality. In other words, the clergy and women religious are almost all from the farm. They're not aware or prepared for modern problems related to industrialization. The flock face dangerous working conditions. They're at the mercy of large corporations. They live in company houses. They get their food from company stores. And if they're going to go out and strike, those company stores are closed to them. And strike they do. Work stoppages in Cape Breton, some of the most infamous strikes are in 1909, 1922, and 1923, create periods of desperation, which according to the late historian Robert Morgan, branded the Cape Breton soul. I love that term. It branded the Cape Breton soul, and it did. There's stories, of kids wearing flour bags. That's how bad it was, because everything was cut off from these families. While the inability of parishioners to get steady work or a living wage had tremendous effect on local pastors, the diocese had no response other than Catholic Truth Society pamphlets. Add to this that Marxist agitators such as the famous and well-studied Scottish-born communist J.B. McLaughlin are preaching their own anti-capitalist religion and starting to find fertile ground among an increasingly frustrated Catholic workforce, and you have a recipe for disaster. While the formal stance against the Marxist rhetoric of some of the most radical labor leaders was well and good, the archives demonstrate that Catholic miners and steelworkers were more concerned with their daily realities than any ideological position. Catholics were angry. While struggling to feed and clothe their children, these faithful are devoted to the Sacred Heart. They devoutly pray the Rosary in the month of October. They belong to societies like the League of the Cross. They donate to parish picnics. They donate to a diocesan college that their children have almost no chance of attending. They collect a cathedricum to support their bishop who has lived 200 kilometers away, et cetera, et cetera. But they look at their church and they don't see any reciprocal, material, or moral support. So whether it's the loss of the traditional base in the countryside or the increasing marginalization of the church among Catholic labor, by the 1920s, Roman Catholicism in Eastern Nova Scotia is fighting for relevancy and survival. And in some places in our country, that's true today as well. Okay. So, within the anatomy of a faith-based movement, once a need has been established, and it's pretty clear in Nova Scotia at this point what the need is, we find that agitators soon appear. Now, these are the individuals who are no longer willing to abide the status quo. They're long past trying to understand the need, and they want action. And the individual who represents the agitators of Eastern Nova Scotia in this period is Father James J. Tompkins. I'm sure many of you have heard about him. Now, I say represents because for far too long in the historiography of the Antigonish movement, built by journalists and scholars alike, we've envisioned the early agitation for Catholic social action in Antigonish as the brainchild of this single individual. Now, of course, Father Tompkins was not the only person to recognize that the church needed to better confront the serious issues of its time. And I've spilled considerable ink pushing back against his hagiography that envelops the priest to this day. He was turned into a literal folk hero, okay? Their Father Jimmy, as they called him, a name, by the way, he absolutely hated, fighting injustice both within and outside the church. But Father Tompkins is an incredibly important part of this story. A descendant of the Newfoundland Irish who settled in Marguerite, Cape Breton, Tompkins was a very short man, he had a really squeaky voice, and he could be very cranky at times. Yet although physically small, his students and colleagues remember him as, quote, awfully mighty. He had been educated at the Propaganda College in Rome and had returned to eastern Nova Scotia in 1902 to teach and serve as vice rector at the Antigonish Diocesan College, St. Francis Xavier University, which you see in the middle. Now keep in mind that St. Francis Xavier University, which I will shorten to CENIVX from here on out, is the central institution within the Diocese of Antigonish. It's the intellectual hub and the pride of the people, although again, most Catholics can't send their kids there. Now, as vice rector of this very important institution, Tompkins is in the perfect position for a holistic examination of the percolating problems that the church and the region are facing. But the one thing he knows is the status quo is going to be disastrous. So he begins to agitate. Initially, he's involved in a few schemes which you might consider the purview of a regional economic enterprise network. He wants to get businesses better organized, or he wants people to buy local, that sort of thing. But by 1918, he and others come to the realization that the only way forward for the Catholic community is A, radically re-educate the flock in Catholic social teaching, and B, completely restructure Catholic post-secondary education as a means of implementing that teaching. So in 1918, Father Tompkins begins a full-scale media campaign within the local Catholic press. He uses his own column, which you see there, called For the People, to have CENIVX intellectuals and prominent laymen contribute scholarly pieces on history, economics, and sociology. He employs a young Henry Somerville, who would later be plucked by the Archbishop of Toronto to edit the Catholic Register, to write newspaper columns that breathe life into age-old teachings of the Church. And in an era when capitalists and communists are battling for the minds of Cape Breton coal miners, Tompkins and Somerville are using encyclicals such as Rerum Novarum to argue for private property, but private property that was spread among many individuals and balanced by responsible Christian stewardship. He's making the argument that Catholics could create a third way if they'd only seek to apply their principles. It's at this moment, very critical moment, that Father Tompkins' ideas on educational reform begin to coalesce around the restructuring of Catholic post-secondary education. By 1919, he's asking some uncomfortable and kind of dangerous questions. Yes, CENIVX is the central diocesan institution. But what were these Catholic colleges accomplishing? Not only did their reliance on clergy with theological degrees hamper the training and programs and subjects like biology and mathematics, but the university is failing the very people who finance the institution. There's no government funding in Nova Scotia for universities until the 1960s. So all the money that's financing this university in this time is coming from the pews. So Tompkins is arguing that sending young men into the seminary is great. We have to have that. We've got to have priests. And it's great that we educate a Catholic elite. We've got to have Catholic judges and lawyers. That's good. But what is CENIVX doing for Margaret MacDonald Campbell, who's struggling on the farm in St. Andrews? What's the university doing to help bring her children home so they can have a full and abundant life in Nova Scotia? In December 1920, Tompkins publishes his famous pamphlet entitled Knowledge for the People, a call to St. Francis Xavier College, which his colleagues called the key statement of his life. It's a challenge to CENIVX to embrace a new spirit of education. If farmers, fishermen, and miners have no chance of attending their school, then the school will go to them. Citing the examples of the Workers' Educational Association in England and the Irish Gaelic League, Tompkins envisions an extension program similar to that of the University of Wisconsin in Madison that had striven since 1891 to bring education to every family in the state. And fighting perceptions that Catholic clergy should stick to spiritual matters, he insists that the movement be led by priests. When, he says, undertaken by the representatives of the church, the material improvement of lives would be raised to the spiritual plane. That's powerful stuff. In the spring of 1921, CENIVX hosts its now famous on-campus People's School. There's a picture of them in the middle, for 57 students from across all sectors of the economy who otherwise would never have stepped foot, not just at CENIVX, but on any college campus. There were courses on everything from public speaking, soil and crops and biology. It's a perfect joy to see the interest these men take in their work, Tompkins wrote elatedly to a friend. Last night, about 27 men sat in a classroom discussing country conditions while there was a howling game of hockey going on at the rink and the shouting could be heard. Even a hockey game didn't throw them off. We have found the lever that will move the world. Now, things are really moving along for Father Tompkins here. But unfortunately, he soon finds himself pastoring to the remote coastal parish of Canso on the periphery of the diocese. It was remote then, and it is remote today. Now, journalists and academics have spilled much ink over his shocking December 1922 transfer, an attempt to both tell a good yarn and also to cleave, I think, Tompkins and his ideas from the church at large. In other words, for years, writers had us believe that Tompkins was making his conservative bishop so uncomfortable with his ideas that he had to be sent away. Banished is the word that they used. The reality is, however, that by the autumn of 1922, Father Tompkins was now arguing that Senevec should relocate from Antigonish town to Halifax, that's some 220 kilometers, to join a proposed University of the Maritimes, much like St. Michael's College, the situation at the University of Toronto. This was extremely unpopular among the rank and file, and when Tompkins begins trading barbs with his bishop within the secular press, he is sent packing. So he's out of there. He's no longer vice rector. He's a pastor. He's a priest in a very remote coastal area. Now, in many cases, when the agitator is removed, so too is the energy from any faith-based movement. Especially in early 20th century Canada, when insubordination against the local bishop is obviously considered taboo, although it happens a lot more than you might think. So another key component of any successful endeavor is the buildup of a large grassroots foundation. With Tompkins and Canso, it's now many of his fellow clergy who once lived by the rhythm of the liturgical calendar are now writing newspaper articles about the exploitation of local lobster fishermen or meeting with journalists about the lack of scientific techniques on the farm. The Antigonish clergy hosted educational conferences that brought community leaders into contact with academic experts. Deserving young farmers are sent to the Provincial Agricultural College, and education clubs are established among the coal miners. The Congregation of the Sisters of St. Martha, first organized in the 1890s to do domestic work at the college, went into the countryside to teach families about canning, budgeting, and home economics. Each individual you see on the screen, plus many others, were the advocates for formal extension work in Antigonish. Each one of these individuals preached on the economic and social potential of Catholic social teaching in their parishes and their classrooms, and each kept the issue squarely in the public eye. These are the folks dealing with the economic fallout on the ground. And for 6 long years, they continue to pressure the diocese bishop, James Morrison, for action. 6 years. Now, for Morrison and the other stakeholders, which is mostly the university administration, this relentless call for change creates considerable anxiety. There's almost no money. People like to always say there's no money, but in this case, there really was very little money, and a great fear of failure. But when a cadre of clergy intellectuals, some of whom are on this screen, finally threatened to create their own extension program through a regional Scottish cultural society, the diocese was forced to act, or as the people in the region still say today, the leadership was scared into action. Senevec was the preeminent Catholic educational institution in the region, and Bishop Morrison, who had already banished the vice rector for suggesting the university move to Halifax, would never allow another educational organization to take leadership. In November 1928, the university commissioned a study to examine the question, and in the spring of 1929, it formally commits to creating an extension department. Now, this is an important moment, I think, because I want to say just a brief word about Archbishop Morrison and the importance of the hierarchy within Catholic social movements. Now, any Catholic community can establish a need, and it can produce agitators, it can foster grassroots support, but no homegrown movement can succeed without the support of the local bishop. We can talk synodality until we're blue in the face, but if your bishop is fearful, uncooperative, or unwilling to listen, there's usually nothing to be done. In normal circumstances, very few people would remember Archbishop James Morrison. His career would have been unremarkable for its time. He would have been a name on a stained glass window in some maritime cathedral. But the Charlottetown Prince Edward Island native is worth remembering. I even wrote a book about him, because although cautious, parochial, frugal, and frankly with a personality I probably wouldn't have liked very much, when presented with a daring plan to alter the economic and social circumstances of his flock, despite his fears, and he had a lot of them, he had the good sense to say yes. Make no mistake, it would have been much easier to say no and continue with the status quo. In 1928, Morrison was nearing 70 years old. He could have coasted through retirement. But the reality is that sometimes the best thing an administrator can do is get out of the way so others can do the work. Speaking of Morrison after his death in 1950, one famous cooperator wrote, "I feel that a bishop just can't spearhead too radical a movement in the economic and social field. He can't do what you and I can do. It's not necessary in any case. If he's broad-minded enough, as Bishop Morrison was, to give the green light to the rest of us, that is all that is required." And I sometimes wish more of our modern Canadian bishops had Morrison's foresight. Okay, so people want an extension department, the bishop is on side, and so now what? Well, I think we'd all agree that any successful faith-based movement needs a charismatic leader. It was true in 1929, it's true today. I think everyone knows of a pastor, priest, or bishop who's wonderful in the sanctuary, but maybe struggles to connect in more secular environments. So not as effective at the hockey rink as they are at the parish hall. The supporters of Extension Movement in Antigonish were offering a pretty radical new way forward, and charismatic leadership was critical. According to the letters and papers of those present, there was always only one individual for the job, and that was Father, later Monsignor Moses Michael Cody. Another native of the great Irish community of Marguerite, Cape Breton, the 46-year-old Cody was a double cousin of Father Tompkins and a close colleague. Armed with a postgraduate degree from the Catholic University of America, Cody had been on the Senevex staff since 1910 and had participated in many of the earlier events connected with the extension journey, such as the People's School. Now, Cody had a couple important skills. The first thing, he's a very good organizer and a very good administrator. He knows how to attract talent, and he knows how to delegate work to that talent, which is very important. And he's got a lot of charisma, as I mentioned. Although physically and intellectually imposing, Cody fit in among the academics, but also among the fishermen. That's critical, right? It's a real skill. Not a lot of people can do that. So this serves him well. He can go into the classroom, he can lecture to folks like you, then he can go to the wharf or go to the coalface and connect with people there. Now, as was the case with Father Tompkins, we must recognize that there were many competent people on Cody's team. Sister Marie Michael, Mary Sarah McKinnon of the Sisters of St. Martha had a degree from the Agricultural College at McGill from Macdonald College and would take leadership with both the movement's propaganda and the Extension Library. Angus Bernard MacDonald, the former inspector of schools for Antigonish County, became Cody's right-hand man, and by the time of his death was a legend within Canadian cooperative circles. In the picture on the left, there's A.B., Joey Smallwood, and Monsignor Cody. And Smallwood tried many times to try to get much of that extension message in Newfoundland, but there was, as people may know, Newfoundland had a pretty sectarianism was fairly institutionalized in Newfoundland, and so it was a bit of a problem to try to implement Catholic social teaching across that island. When Extension opens a Glace Bay field office in 1932, they turn not to a priest, but to the 45-year-old former communist labor leader, Alexander McIntyre, as the face of the movement in that community. So I just want to bring attention that it's not just Cody driving around in his car by himself getting all of this done. Yet, while we don't adhere to the great man theory of history anymore, there's no question that Monsignor Cody was one of a kind. In fact, many years later, most could still recall where they were when they heard that the Monsignor had passed away. The great cooperator Alexander Laidlaw, upon hearing the news in the middle of a meeting in Saskatoon, felt that some kind of world had come to an end. That was the kind of effect that Cody had on others. He knew how to evangelize, and that was extremely important for this movement. Okay, so how does Cody and his staff plan on changing the region's fortunes? What's the program? On 8 September 1930, at the West Bay Road in Inverness County, Cape Breton, the first mass meeting is called. Now, this mass meeting would be replayed over and over again, time and time again, parish after parish. The priest calls the community together. Monsignor Cody arrives with his staff, and they give them a rousing speech. They deliver a message, and the message they're delivering is simple. They believe in the primacy of the individual. They believe that social reform must come through education. They believe education must begin with the economic, and everyone deserves a full and abundant life. That's what they're telling folks in the communities. And how's this going to manifest itself? Well, not only will Extension educate regular folks on topics from literacy to soil retention, but the Catholics of Eastern Nova Scotia will work out their own economic salvation by creating a new economic system, a third way between laissez-faire capitalism and state control. So after the mass meeting, everyone's very excited, and some people want to get to work. Interested parishioners are encouraged by their parish priest to join a local study club. And these are small gatherings, 10 to 12 people, that are held in stove-heated kitchens or chilly parish halls. Each study club would then elect its own leader to move the club forward and to liaise with Extension representatives to identify local economic or social problems. A circulating library provided the clubs with study materials, and participants are expected to read and discuss these publications. The goal is to educate and then seek real and tangible strategies to change their circumstances. It's pretty incredible because by the end of 1931, there's 173 active study clubs in 43 parishes and hundreds of regular people with some on grade 4 and 5 education are empowered to examine complex issues of agronomy and finance. In one Victoria County community, merely investigating potato seed varieties increased annual production by 75%. When the study club at Dover, coastal Dover in Guysborough County, tackled literacy, some 20 fishermen learned to read in 1 year. Other communities like Inverness County worked with their cranberry industry. Port Felix puts in a new general store. They overcome incredible odds within their cooperative endeavors, while Catholics in Sydney established a central marketing organization called the Cape Breton Island Producers Cooperative. By pooling an order of fertilizer totaling some 3,000 tons, one Cape Breton cooperative saved $20,000 for local farmers. Now, while these early successes are pretty remarkable, we always have to be careful not to get carried away. You might be sensing a theme of mine here. Some of these early study clubs eventually peter out. Participants needed a lot of self-discipline and oftentimes a little courage, as some communities viewed the whole program as a bit naive at first. And despite the great achievements in the rural sectors and in the coastal communities where lobster cooperatives changed the fortunes of the fishermen, Extension struggles in the colliery towns where the complexities of industry, markets, finance, capital often overwhelm the field workers. And some of Extension's solutions to the problems of poverty, such as encouraging idle coal miners to plant potatoes on vacant plots of land, or having miners relocate their families to the countryside, were sometimes met with hostility. Even Monsignor Cody privately conceded that coal miners and steelworkers lacked the resources and organization to fully become masters of their own destinies. Yet by and large, this was a movement that continued to gain steam. With interest in cooperatives high, the study club soon began to investigate credit unions. With the support of the American credit union activist Roy Burgengran, Extension lobbied to get the Credit Union Act passed through the Nova Scotia legislature. On a frigid December evening in 1931, 19 families in the mining town of Reserve Mines, Cape Breton, because many people, or many more families than that, lived in Reserve at that time, but many people just thought the idea was crazy. 19 families pooled their lifetime savings, are you ready for it? $4.75, and started a community bank. It's the first credit union. And I know it's just going to drive Professor McLeod crazy because he thinks Broad Cove was the first, but it's a close second. It's a close second. In the meantime, though, people from outside the diocese are taking notice. At the 1938 Educational Conference, then named the Rural and Industrial Conference, there's a large contingent of foreign delegates and some 200 American cooperators later toured the region. By the end of the decade, the extension message had spread outside the diocese and was encouraging programs in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. As the movement gains further distinction, leaders such as Monsignor Cody become recognizable names throughout Canada. Discerning people, noted one Toronto reporter, are beginning to call him one of the great Canadians. In April 1938, the Vatican Secretary of State and future Pope Pius XII notified the diocese that Pope Pius XI had bestowed his apostolic benediction on their work. He noted that Son of X followed a unique program, one that implemented the encyclical instructions of both Rerum Novarum of 1891 and Quadrissimo Anno of 1931. Needless to say, for the people in a relatively small part of the world, this is a major accomplishment. Now, it's important to note, I think, that the work of extension has consequences for the community that go well beyond the economic. As a historian interested in Canadian Catholicism, I want to say a word about women here because it's an extremely part of the story. And oftentimes when we're lecturing about the Catholic Church, there's a lot of Father this and Monsignor that. And within the sanctuary, the narrative was obviously at times male dominant. Yet historians working in the archives or through their lived experiences all know that women, such as my ancestor Margaret MacDonald Campbell mentioned earlier, were always active in the community and understood perhaps better than men the effect that the poor economy was having on their families. Yet before 1928, despite the Herculean work of religious communities such as the Congregation of Notre Dame or the Sisters of St. Martha as teachers and nurses, there was no few women in the public eye. The Antigonish Movement changes that reality. Okay? As women take leadership positions within study clubs, and women religious such as Sister Mary Anselm, Irene Doyle, as well as lay women, famous lay women, I should say, such as Zita Cameron and Ellen Arsenal, assume operational leadership. In 1935, the Sisters of St. Martha opened the Catholic Charities and Welfare Association in industrial Cape Breton and coordinate with organizations like the newly formed Children's Aid Society. By the late 1940s, the most famous weekly column in the diocesan press comes from the pen of the Baltimore-born Dr. Doris Boyle, who encourages women to confront the problems in their own backyards. And if somebody's looking for a graduate thesis, this Doris Boyle is somebody that I would encourage you to look into. She's married, she came from Baltimore, she married George Boyle, who I don't speak about today, but was called the pen of the Antigonish Movement. He was one of the great minds, and the two of them were an incredible couple, and she lived to 2002, and I know she's got an archive, and nothing's been done on her. So there's a plug for an aspiring young graduate student. So we have to remember that while women in Catholic leadership becomes commonplace after the Second Vatican Council in 1965, it's established much earlier in Canada through the Antigonish Movement. Okay, so the movement has its successes. It's got great popularity. In 1943, it opens its own radio station, CJFX, the University of the Air, to broadcast its message throughout the kitchens and living rooms of the Maritimes. Journalists are writing about the extension program. New books are being published. There's a film board production created. Its leaders are given honorary degrees. And the Pope's representative in Canada wants all Canadian seminarians to study the down-to-earth activities of Antigonish. It's all great stuff. By the early 1950s, the relationship between the responsibilities of the individual within the church and the responsibilities of the church to the individual were radically redefined. Whether it was the move to organize the Grail movement or religious life conferences, Catholics were serious about creating a communion of believers and wanted Antigonish to represent the mystical body in action. That's what they were about. And by the late 1950s, the church in eastern Nova Scotia filled more needs than you can imagine and ran everything from alcoholic treatment centers to retirement homes to vocational schools. And yet, times were changing. When Monsignor Cody started out in 1929, there was very limited government involvement in the lives of citizens. The province of Nova Scotia, for example, did not participate in the old age pensions program until the mid-1930s. There's no crown corporations to develop the economy. There's no grants or deferred maintenance payments to Nova Scotia's universities. Monsignor Cody's message of subsidiarity, the belief that issues should be sorted at the local level, therefore resonated deeply. But after Cody's death in 1959, he had stepped down in 1952 due to ill health. Many old cooperators recognized that a waning of the message and a growth in post-war government spending presented a grave threat to the fabled Antigonish movement. If the government was now the entity to ensure living wages, decent working conditions, and economic opportunity, how could citizens grounded in Catholic social teaching ensure that the people adhered to that position? There was real concern among priests ministering in rural areas that post-war financing for Canada's colleges, for example, would turn the focus of the diocesan institutions like St. FX from the problems of the farmers and the fishermen and the miners to new dormitories, classrooms, and elite programs. Now, in 1956, the St. FX Board of Governors approved a bond issue of nearly $2 million for construction on the Antigonish campus. And it's a real watershed moment in our story. As the governor sat in, quote, stunned and respectful silence, this man, Father Michael Gillis, a great champion and one of the real ringleaders of the Antigonish movement, he stands and he argues passionately that the school is losing its focus and he's abandoning the principles of the Antigonish movement. Instead of new buildings, Gillis wanted to expand outreach. He wants to deepen the course offerings, especially in regards to agriculture, and strengthen the extension program. On behalf of the common man who has loved St. FX for more than half a century and sacrificed much these past years, he pleaded, I appeal for a serious consideration of the expansion of the Extension Department. Yet, as with the case with many boards, I'm sure you all know, the outcome was a foregone conclusion, and the decision to borrow went ahead. And the rest really is history, as St. FX has long ceased to be a Catholic institution. As many of the personalities of the movement began to pass away, by the 1960s, government intervention in Atlantic Canada is ubiquitous. Where once priests with postgraduate training toured the countryside dispensing advice to farmers, bureaucrats in the Provincial Department of Agriculture now jealously claimed authority over the region's farmers. The belief that people could become masters of their own destinies was replaced by a reliance on development agencies and crown corporations. And as federal taxpayer-funded entities like the Cape Breton Development Corporation worked to diversify the local economy, the clergymen like Father Michael Gillis, who had once organized local once organized the rural and industrial conferences, well, they all slowly go back into the sanctuary. Federal ministers like Alan J. McCacken, who once proclaimed the message of subsidiarity from the pulpit of the diocesan radio station, now doled out taxpayer monies on one scheme after another. Consequently, the church had to struggle again to remain relevant in social and economic fields. There are many people in many foreign countries, observed one priest as early as 1963, who know much more about the Antigonish movement than some people in Antigonish itself. Through the gradual acceptance of government monies for schools, colleges, and hospitals, the message of extension was slowly weakened. As one clerical historian wrote in the 1970s, the government moved in behind the church and took over the fields they plowed and seeded. There was no secret as to what was happening, but the church could do little to stop it. While extension field workers still did very important work, soon many Catholics began to wonder if the Diocese program of subsidiarity had run its course. Was there a need for the church to remain so heavily involved when secular organizations were actively pursuing economic endeavors? Others thought that the Catholic social teaching of Tompkins and Cody would be better off applied in far-off lands like the Dominican Republic and Chile through the work of the Cody International Institute. Again, not a big secret as to what's happening, but little, it seemed, could be done to stop it. But here's the interesting thing. While the Extension Department was reduced to a shell by the 1980s, the challenges hadn't gone away. And while the office was downgraded and eventually pushed to the periphery of the St. FX campus, a small dedicated group of field workers continued to confront the seemingly endless economic and social challenges of the maritime provinces. Communities that have watched their economic industries collapse. Think the Sydney Steel Mill in the 60s, or the fishery in the 1980s and 1990s, or more recently witnessed their schools close as Halifax draws more youth in from the countryside, understand both the material and psychological support of a faith-based organization that's committed to education and support. In the 1980s, Dan McGuinness, a great fellow, great scholar and a great guy, then a young sociologist at Cenevex, courageously argued that the Antigonish movement had become a live ghost. The live ghost was the most perilous of all Celtic myths. It went everywhere with field workers to remind them of Extension's fabled past and their now inability to live up to the successes of the earlier days. But that doesn't mean, at least I don't think, the Catholic social action has to end. The question for today is, what needs are there to be addressed? People still struggle to make ends meet, and the increasing demands on working people's time, as we all know, has profound effects on the family. Housing's in the news every day, but few realize the great successes that were once made with housing cooperatives. Do we have agitators and grassroots support? It's a good question. And how can Catholic social teaching address some of the many problems that we face in a very technological world? Education, for education's sake, is certainly noble and important. But Father Tompkins believed that Catholic institutions had a greater and equally noble obligation to the flock. What we need to remember, if you take anything away from me today, from the Antigonish movement, is that the clergy and women religious were never, ever confined to the sanctuary. And their investment in improving the spiritual and material well-being of the flock gave priests like Monsignor Cody a popularity that lasts even to this day. The idea that the church should confine itself to baptisms and funerals would have been roundly rejected by Catholics in Antigonish in the early 20th century. And their great devotion to diocesan projects like the Antigonish movement were ultimately an expression of love for one another. Whether there'll be another chapter in Canadian history remains to be seen. Thank you very much.